Hello and welcome to the Black Soldier Fly Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, David Tavernor, and in this series we dig beneath the surface to uncover what's really happening inside the Black Soldier Fly industry. Hello and welcome to the Black Soldier Fly Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, David Tavernor, and the guest I have with me today is from South Africa. I met him last year on my travels. He is the CEO of Maltento. It's Dean Smorenburg. Hey Dean, how's it going?
Hi David, I'm good. Thanks for having me on the show, and hello to your listeners.
Cool. So let's get into it. Tell me your story. How did you fall into Black Soldier Flies?
Yeah, so a bit of a strange one, but I suppose anyone who's in this industry has a strange story to tell. But my background, I'm from South Africa, Cape Town. Grew up here, went a very traditional finance sort of route. So I was doing business science and CFA and those things, and got myself into management consulting. But I always had this sort of, I think it's actually an OCD the more I look at it, where I really just disliked the concept of food waste. So you go to a restaurant, you don't eat your top bun, I don't eat my garnish salad, and we throw that into the bin or we drop it on the floor and we call that waste. And it always kind of just frustrated me that there was nowhere to get that back into the food chain. And in about 2015, I started playing with earthworms, just literally eating my food scraps from home in my digs. And I was doing some research and came across the black soldier fly, which a number of companies had started looking into and are sort of starting to try commercialize it, and just found it fascinating. And I found a guy on the internet in South Africa who was selling sort of wild flies or wild eggs caught in Durban, which is a tropical area in South Africa. And it was basically like it's a Craigslist type website or Facebook marketplace in these days, and got some off the internet and started growing them in a tote bin in the back of my house. And then kind of the fascination just grew and moved into a flat with my then girlfriend, my now wife. And in the spare bathroom, we had a fly cage trying to learn how to breed flies. And on the balcony, we had a meat box full of larvae and trying to grow them. And I would go off on training for consulting, and my wife had to tend to the larvae at the time. So that was kind of the beginning where the bug bit, I suppose. But I was fortunate. I had a kind of a number of lucky steps. One was, at that point when the sort of bug bit, I left my consulting world with sort of a top tier consulting firm. But one of my friends who had been in consulting was doing a case for a big corporate client that was looking into these markets. And they asked me to come on and be sort of a technical advisor, someone who understood private equity and someone who understood insects. And I went around the world and looked at different technologies, much like you did, just not quite as wide a tour as you managed to do. So I'm very, very jealous of what you managed to do. But at the time, I was one of the few people that had seen inside a few plants, and there was still quite new technology. But basically, I got to see what companies were doing, how they were doing it, the business models they were applying, and and that's kind of on the back of that formed the idea for Maltento, which was effectively I saw sort of two key issues. One was at the time the ability to deal with these waste sources was quite challenging. So in order to bring in dirty waste streams, you had to separate that, you had to decontaminate it. There's a lot of upfront costs, which includes rental, electricity, people, and just the risk to get that to a feedstock for an insect. And then it creates a huge amount of inconsistencies in the farming of that insect because all things change. And on the other side, people were trying to compete with fish meal. And fish meal is just going to stick at a really low price point. And we didn't have the volume or the volume or the price points that we could hit even as an industry at those points. And so it was always about how do you add value to the larva? How do you get more value? Sort of, we always talk about sort of your rands, which are currently your rands per wet weight larva as your key metric for us from a revenue perspective. So if you take it back to you've actually farmed an insect, how do you sell more of those kilograms and for more? And so we started in the sort of whole dried larva space and selling that into the American market and doing quite nicely out of that into the American backyard chicken market. You can see on this shoulder over here, Grubbies, which was our sort of whole dried larva product that we were B2B. So we sold to a lot of businesses in America. And then, that was kind of where the business started. We have a facility here in Epping in Cape Town, South Africa, where when we started, we had 1,600 square meters, and that's sort of grown to 7,000 square meters. Where we produce about 120 tons of insects per month now.
So you're literally going from someone who hates food waste and hates it so much that you're bathing in them in your spare bathroom.
Ironic, right? I thought of it that way, but you're right.
And you've got the meat box outside, so you've literally got your kitchen and your bathroom sorted. What more do you need?
100%. And it was like there was some heat coming from the bins. I mean, it all made sense at the time. You can
Perfect.
imagine
Yeah,
how much my
set up
girlfriend
for
loved it.
winter.
Yeah. It's kind of a surprise still that she stuck around, I guess.
Yeah, so you haven't got 120 tons of maggots coming from a bathroom then.
Look, the
I've been to
condition,
your place and I could call it a factory. I'll give you that title, not a
thank you.
bathroom.
The condition was that all the insects left the house, so I wasn't allowed any more insects in the house as the business grews. Every time I bring home a little experiment to try some insects in the air fryer or something, I get a bit of a frown these days. She's not as tolerant as she used to be, I guess. But the parts of the sort of
Fair enough. Fair
just on the
enough.
business model, I mentioned the upfront waste part. So we still work with waste streams, but we work with your sort of, I guess, your pre-consumer waste because we wanted to sell into the US market and the EU markets and UK. And so we largely partnered with breweries. And so we work largely with spent brewery grains and spent brewery yeast as our input. We don't have the challenges like you have in the EU, where there's a lot of anaerobic digestion and things like that competing for those resources. So we do compete a little bit with agri, but there's a large amount of sort of shipping or trucking that's required in order to get this very wet substrate from the brewery to the pig farm or the dairy farm. And so we're able to set up quite close by. So again, reduce the greenhouse gases required in the transport system. So I guess that has allowed us to kind of control the upfront system as well as the transport of it too.
And that's really interesting. So, in your experience, do you find working with a product like brewer's grains, which I would assume it's quite high protein, and I would also assume that it's pretty consistent if it's coming from a large brewery, it would be, right?
Yeah.
So, and how does that impact the rest of your operation then?
So brewery grain is an interesting one. We also, if you look at it, it looks like it has high protein, but that protein is largely sort of tied up in cellulose, hemicellulose type structures. Apologies to anyone more technical than me that's not properly right, but that's what I understand. But so that's tied up, and your sugars have really been extracted from the brewing process. So we always joke that you have a bit of a conflict of interest with the brewery because they're trying to extract all that sugar out and leave you with nothing. So really what you're left with is a nice fibrous material that we sort of term, it's almost like a pillow that allows the larva to move through it really easily. It also kind of remains quite aerobic, and that obviously helps with the larva's movement and allowing them to eat a bit deeper. But then you kind of have to subsidize that diet with other things to add your proteins, your simple sugars, carbohydrates that allow the larva to grow quicker so that you can turn over your chambers quicker. So we substitute with really where we can as much yeast from the brewery as well. So that gives a lot of the protein source, some sort of micros in there as well. And then mainly sort of bakery byproducts provides the carbohydrates to the diet. But we try and stick to like a really high brewery diet and try and really, I think what we've tried to do is sort of really specialize on the brewery diet because it's so available in South Africa at a relatively okay price. But it's still, look, it adds up by the time you've got to diet cost. It's, again, talking about that sort of revenue per wet weight larva. If you also look at the feedstock cost per wet weight larva, it still kind of adds up by the time you've got your larva through bioconversion and then you're drying, etc.
Cool. And you started off with a lot of backyard chicken market in the US. You're into pet food now, primarily, from what I understand. And
Correct.
over your right shoulder, you've got the Pallet Plus. Tell me a bit about that.
Yeah. So again, it goes back to that sort of original thesis. So basically, what we were trying to do is add more revenue per wet weight larva. And there's a few issues with creating any form of dry product, right? Meals or whole dried larva. The larva itself is 70% moisture. So in order to make any of those products, you have to drive off 70% of the volume of that product or the weight of that product, and it just gets evaporated. So what we started to look at is how do you try and use that whole larva? So instead of evaporating it, why don't you try and use it into a product that has more value? So one is it's obviously very expensive to drive off that moisture, especially through that chitin sort of wax cuticle, which is just doesn't like to lose moisture. So it was how do we kind of take that product and how do we turn it into something of more value? When we were looking at sort of pet food and aquaculture, and we came across these things called palatants and feed intake enhancers in aquaculture. Same thing, just a different name. And basically, these were generally liquid products that go through hydrolysis type processes and they get other things added to it, and that makes these sort of flavors. So I guess like a gravy, if you will. And so we started looking down this, and generally or traditionally, those products are made out of liver and viscera type byproducts, and they're made by these large multinational businesses. And if you look at sort of the value that those products add, they're adding a performance value. So in pet food in particular, what happens is you make a dog kibble, for instance, That gets extruded, comes out like a kibble, gets coated with oil, and it gets coated with these palatants. And these palatants then are used to attract the dog or cat to come and eat that product. And so effectively what you're selling is more of a performance type product than just a protein. So we don't sell a product based on the protein content. We based it on the performance, which we test in sort of kennel trials or sort of, focus groups with dogs, I guess. That's allowed us to kind of focus on getting more revenue out of the larva. But not only that, we can sell the whole larva rather than selling just the dry portion of the larva. We do also do a spray dried version of that. But again, because you're selling more bulk and adding things to that to more of a product than just a commodity, it allows us to fetch a higher price point, and we can compete against the sort of the incumbents in that market doing the more traditional viscera type products because we're smaller, we don't have huge overheads, we build in what we use and how we use it. So that's allowed us to actually compete against those products that we don't have to ask for a green premium. We can actually compete on price too.
Sounds great. And actually, all I can think of right now is dogs sitting around a table and chatting about your product in their focus group, to be honest.
I wish they
The
would.
drying,
The issue with the dogs is they don't speak too much. So unfortunately, you'll do a 2-bowl test if it is like the sort of key thing you do in these types of trials. The dog then chooses which bowl. But sometimes, depending on the day and how the weather and how the dogs are feeling that day, they might go another way to what you predict.
yeah.
And
I think my
unfortunately,
dog,
can't
it's
ask
a
them.
black Labrador, so I think it just goes to the nearest food.
Eat anything, exactly.
Yeah. The drying is interesting, and you touched upon quite a really interesting point there. And I was at BSF Con in Cambridge yesterday, and I think it was Damien Josefiak, which I've probably pronounced wrong, who's CEO of Hypermine or co-founder of Hypermine in Poland. And he basically said that the most expensive cost of everything is drying because of the wet, how wet they are, as you said. And if we think of soybean, the enemy of insect protein, that dries in the field. It's already dry when it comes out the
Yeah.
field. So that the last bit of drying really doesn't take up much expense at all. So I think you've got something there which is quite interesting. And so who are your customers for the Pallet Plus?
So we work mainly with pet food businesses. So we'll work with there's two sort of key customers. One is the brand. So the brand owner of that person who owns it and sort of markets their brand. In an example, a Hills or a Mars or, those type of products, a Kana. But then you also there's a slight nuance in that you also have contract manufacturers. Someone, there's some big diamond pet foods in America, United in Europe and the UK and now in America. Those type of customers are the types of people you have to approach. So you've got a branded customer and you've got a co-man. The co-mans will produce products on behalf of some brands. So not all brands own their own manufacturer. And so it's interesting because there's quite a few key role players that you need to be sort of selling the product to. What we probably didn't appreciate enough in the beginning is that palatants are not a simple sell. It's not a commodity that you say, here's 50% protein, 30% fat product, replace ours with whoever's. It's a much more critical product because of that performance aspect and the fact that you can have rejection on the product because of it. And so unless you're really confident they are very confident that you can perform as a flavor, you're just not going to get into that product. And so the sales cycle is pretty long. It's not simple and hasn't been simple. And we've learned a hell of a lot over the last 4 years as we've been developing this product. There's a lot of learning in it. It's not as simple as great. You have more revenue and you're not trying the larva out. And so I suppose it's taken us a long time to get to where we are now.
Yeah, fair enough. But if you're exporting it around the world, then there's obviously opportunity here, and it's a real niche that you're carving out. But that's exactly what you need to do to find those high value segments. And I was reviewing my notes from my visit last year, and what stood out to me was that point of adding nutrition and the marketability of insect protein, and you can marry those up at the sort of smaller inclusion rates for those manufacturers, so then they can shout about all of the good stuff in it for their marketing, but also add in the nutrition or the palatability, like you said.
Yeah, I think so. Look, it's an interesting product. So we've got a bit of an identity crisis in that we are an insect business and we passionate about the sustainability element of the business. I think in reality, and I was also reading some notes from someone who was at BSF Con yesterday, who was just saying, sustainability and all that is critical. People care, but they're not paying for it. And it's, at the end of the day, it's almost a sanitary factor. It's not something that's sort of allowing companies to sell more of this product. And you're seeing it in the market. Like in Europe and UK, there's definitely more insect protein, but in America, very few big companies have actually taken the dip into producing an insect-based product. We decided to rather focus on a product that we could sell against a traditional protein product, in the case of sort of livers, and it could move on to your savory chicken product. It could move on to your roast beef flavor. So we don't necessarily play purely into an insect space. And so, as I say, it's kind of like we want the insect story because we think it's important and makes us unique. But at the end of the day, we have to compete against what's in the market so that we can quote, as I say, the roast beef flavored product. So we always the analogy that we use is that, we want to play into the whole hamburger market and be an ingredient into that. We don't want to just be an ingredient into, say, like what a vegan burger would be, where your market size is significantly smaller. So even if you are the dominant ingredient into the vegan burger market, you're always just the vegan burger market. And so that's
Yes, I
kind of,
see.
again, how we look at it.
There's a lot of similarities here with what you've just said, and in my first podcast episode with Clayton Payne, just to recap, Clayton is a pet food expert here in the UK and has worked globally distributing pet products over the last 30 years, and he's dipped his toe into the black soldier fly market, sensing an opportunity. However, what he's said mainly about the European pet food market, particularly around black soldier fly, is similar to that. It's plateaued. And it's actually sort of the demand is coming down as people start to suss out the pet owners start to suss out the sustainability messaging isn't quite outweighing the lack of nutrition in some of these products. And I say lack of nutrition because as insect protein remains higher price than alternative meats as their byproducts, the inclusion of the insect protein is a lot lower because you're trying to manage your product mix and the price mix. And so the quality is therefore lower because you're filling it with a lot of cheaper stuff to pay for the insect protein. And it's not quite working together. It's pretty strong views from him, but he's an expert in the industry, so you got to listen to an extent. But if you can reasonably add in for functional benefits, and then absolutely that makes sense. And if it's right, like you say you are, then it sounds like a good product.
So yeah, I mean, look, we've got. I think his view, I don't think is that crazy. Because insect protein, one, there's not huge volumes of it, so it's hard for your big Marses and Hills and them to kind of use these type of products yet because there's just not enough sort of security of supply, and the price point is just too high for them to use. We have a bit of a different view on insects in that I don't think that they're a wonderful standalone protein source and should be the bulk protein source in a product. I think that market for an insect-based product should absolutely be there, and there will be people who will buy those products, and I do. I feed that to my dog, and she's very healthy. But I actually think where insects play a more critical role is at the lower inclusion levels. Take aside palatants and things like that we do. Even in meals, if you can include that into a product at 2.5 or 5%, the sort of functional benefits that come from those insects, I believe, are absolutely there. So we've seen impacts in gut health, we've seen impacts on immunity of those animals, and sort of what I forget the term that my grub club used, but it's like back end performance. It's kind of like your poos are easier to pick up, or your dog, sorry, not your poos, your dog poos are easier to pick up. Everything about it just becomes, it's a good product to have. And it doesn't mean it has to be the bulk protein. So I think, at least in the short term, the products that will win in the insect pet food market will be the hybrid protein sources. So where you've got a lamb and insect, or Hills' one is the pollard and insect, which is a dual protein. So not only from a health benefit, I think it's a good product, but I actually think the ability to, well, again, as much as the dogs will eat this and your Labrador will eat this, at the end of the day, you're selling to a human. And that human has got to believe that this is better for their dog. And it's a much lower bar if you say, here's something that's got a known protein in it and it's subsidized with some insects. I think that's just a lot easier sell for now. Maybe one day insect protein will become a big thing. But again, without sort of rambling on about the vegan burger marketing, I think, again, it's really hard to sit in front of people and say, look, everybody must become vegan because for the world, beef is such a terrible thing and everyone must stop and cut out meat completely, versus just trying to reduce the amount of beef that we eat and everybody just becomes slightly more minimalistic for one lunchtime a week they cut meat out. That impact of everybody doing something like that would be much bigger than changing the vegan market from whatever 2% to 2.5%. It's not going to not going to turn the needle really. So the analogy is that I think you'll get more people adopted to insects and understanding it and more comfortable with it if you introduce it a bit slower. And again, I think it's more suited to what the insect's role is in an animal diet.
Yeah, a lot of that rings true. And going back to BSF Con yesterday, because it's hot on my mind, and dipping into aquaculture as well, there was Catherine Breyer, who was the global director of marketing at Biomar, was talking. She was fantastic, actually. And she said there was a couple of sound bites. There was lots of sound bites from her, but a couple I've just got in front of me. We don't buy ingredients, we buy nutrients. And they've partnered with InnovaFeed with a lot of their shrimp diet, and they say this is a functional replacement. It's not a protein replacement, and they don't view insect protein as a alternate. In fact, she said you need to stop calling it an alternative protein.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree completely. If I can, there's been our trials with our feed intake enhancers. So we've got a product for pet food, or we've got a few products for pet food, and we've also got products for aquaculture. And we've done a number of trials in America as well as Europe and in South Africa, mainly on trout species, so trout, rainbow trout and salmon. Really fascinating. So really low inclusion of our liquid product as a coating. And we've also done a dry product, but effectively increase to feed intake, which is sort of the sanitary factor. It's what you want. So those fish start eating the product more aggressively, which means that you're wasting less food. So there's less float out of that food out of the system, or drop out and sinking, and therefore just wasted food that never actually gets into the gut or the animal's stomach. And so that was the first part. But then what was really interesting is we took blood work from these fish and we did proteomics with Mary Health Solutions, who have become quite prominent in this space. And what we saw were the three kind of markers turned on in the fish. One was chitin catabolism, the other was guts, intestinal tract, GIT, and the other was immunity. And where we saw that play out in various trials, and we've had some really sort of, what do we call it, like lucky, unluckies, is that we've had a few stress events happen in these trials. So one, the heat pump broke and the water temperatures rose to 26 degrees Celsius. In another, we had an outbreak of Aeromonas at a commercial farm. And in another, we were testing smaller sort of runt type fish against your jumbos. And in all those situations where there was more of a stress event, one, the runtier fish sort of had a similar mortality to the jumbos, which you would normally expect a much higher mortality in the runt fish because they're just generally not as strong as young fish. And then with the Aeromonas and the heat pump breaking in those stress events, we had about a 20% lower mortality in those trials. So again, I'm not sitting here saying that we've got the magic bullet and that, we're 20% lower mortality in any stress event. But I think indicatively, at least, it points to the fact that at a really low inclusion, there's a stimulatory effect on the animal that allows it to be more resilient, much like if you have a flu jab and whatever, COVID or any form of flu goes around, the person who's got a stronger immunity is the one who will get less sick. I think that's fair to say. And it's not dissimilar to that in animals. So again, I think she's absolutely right. So I think that's where we've managed to kind of at least prove through formal trials that insects play a role beyond just a nutritional protein source.
So, Dean, we've spoken a lot about the markets, and I want to talk more about financing to get to this point, because there's a lot of listeners who would be interested in how do you get from that zero to where you are now?
Good question. So I can only speak to our experience, obviously. My experience was quite unique, actually. So I mentioned that I did that consulting project. On the back of that, what happened was we partnered with a local business that at the time was doing, it raised sort of the largest round in the insect space. It raised a huge amount of money, and it sort of made big promises of global domination in the space. And what landed up happening is they didn't make it. So within 4 or 5 years, that company was done and had never built a single large-scale commercial plant other than the pilot they had in South Africa. And so all those promises never came true. So I think that's maybe some context to the way we raise money. We generally raise, when I sort of started the business, we raise mainly from family office type businesses. We had a little bit of enterprise development funding, which was like a soft loan, and a little bit of bank funding from sort of development finance institutes. But yeah, so generally so I'm rumbling a bit here. So the learning for us, or what I didn't want to do, was go and raise a massive amount of money based on a dream and sort of selling a Excel spreadsheet. We wanted to do it in a bit more of a stepwise sort of process. And effectively, we raised a little bit of money through family offices, proved a number of points. One being, we can grow insects and we can kind of get that right, even though the numbers don't necessarily make sense and the cost per larva is way too high. But we can make them and we can dry them and sell them into that American backyard chicken market at a reasonable price point. We then looked at it as, okay, let's raise some more money and let's scale that now. That's when we moved from that sort of 1,600 squares to 5,500 squares. And it was sort of a midway step. And then prove that we could grow lots of insects and do that pretty well. And we're at the point now that, we could grow significantly more insects. It's really like the way we do it, which is very Western. So we farm in big chambers and bins and things like that. So not what you might see in China or sort of East or West Africa. Not poo-pooing those models, just not the way we do it. But we can really scale our technology now, and it's really controlled. And then from there, when we kind of made some breakthroughs in that palatant market, we scaled that side. So we did it, I like to say, sort of in an honest and conservative way. Whether it's completely the right way to do it, I think is it's debatable. I think the positives are you sleep better at night because you haven't misled anyone to, down your road. But I think on the other side, it means that you're consistently kind of only raising enough to get to that next step. And sometimes that makes you make shorter term decisions than potentially something that might be a better long-term decision. But yeah, that's been our kind of way of doing it, I guess. And as I say, I sleep well at night because of that. And I think, as we've seen in this market, the guys have gone for these massive facilities without learning how to actually farm an insect and manage that system. Forget all the technology and automation you can put in there. One is if you sort of management of that biological system is a challenge. And if you don't know it at small scale, it's going to be really challenging and things are going to come at you fast on big scale. But secondly, the fact that we haven't had to sell significant volumes into the market, hundreds of tons, as some people claim, has sort of helped us to be more resilient and sort of weather these storms over the last few years and sort of weather the slow market, I guess.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense, and I agree. Would you say it's fair, or would you say it's fair that you have grown your supply with the demand, or the other way around? I suppose, have you grown the demand
Yeah,
as
so
you've produced?
yes, to a degree. I think again, this industry's been a bit lumpy. I don't think it's been a beautiful, up to the right type curve. So we had times where there was a bit of hype and you could sell. We were completely under supply. We just could not supply the amount of market that we needed into the whole dried larva market. But then a combination of, China coming in with much cheaper bugs into America plus tariffs have made that market quite challenging. So as soon as we had that ability to like produce at will, suddenly it's a market challenges. So unfortunately, it's not always a perfect science. And then again, from our game, because you have to produce larvae to get fit, so you can produce a lot of larvae so that when the palatants pick up, you can sell those all. Production of larvae was higher than our demand for digest and palatants. And so that, meant you had to dry product. And so it does create this sort of quite a difficult process to manage in the short term. But you don't want to be tying up too much volume into sort of bad price commodities when you're trying to play into the palatant game, which again, you need long-term secure supply. Otherwise people won't even look at you.
Sure. I'm going to jump back a bit, actually. Terrible hosting by me. I've just remembered a question that I obviously forgot at the time. When we were talking about more the detail of the product and your customers and things, could you tell me more of a process of how do you sell the product? If I'm a pet food manufacturer in the UK, how do I get my hands on your product?
So we have a salesperson. We have a senior sales manager in Europe, for one. So he can come visit you. And he's much better at selling these palatants than I am. So he comes from the world of palatants. So he was with one of the two large companies in the market for 10 odd years. So he knows a lot more how to sell these type of products than I do. I'm pretty good at selling the business and the passion for it. But effectively, again, it's a slightly different sell. So there's certain people you will, within the company, from nutritionists to the brand itself to the procurement, that you'll speak to, and there's sort of an order at which you speak to those types of people. And again, with a co-manufacturer, that's true too, because you need this to be one of the ingredients they can offer to those brands. And we'll go to them and say, look, what are you currently using? Whichever products they're using from the sort of the bigger companies doing this. We will then say, we can offer you a product that competes with that particular patented you're using, and we can offer a price point that is competitive to that product. Then what will likely happen is that you provide samples, you go into trials where they will coat a kibble with our product and they'll coat a kibble with a competitor product. And then they will either put that into kennel trials, or they'll put that out to, you get these different type of kennel trials where you literally have sort of home-based trials where these companies will basically send kibble samples to a number of homes, like they could send it to you and me. We would put 2 bowls down for our dog, and then you would report on that information. So it's trying to create more of a home-based trialing environment versus a kennel, which is, there's obviously some sort of ethical challenges around kennels for some people, as well as it's not really a home environment. So it's a very kind of sterile environment, which might mean the dog acts differently. If those trials go well, and they might do multiple of those, then they will go and fine, we can replace what we're currently using and use your product. So it's quite a long road. With the bigger companies, it can take 3 years for some of them to move. Smaller companies might take 6 months to a year. So it's really, as I said earlier, I think we were a little bit naive moving into this market. And in hindsight, you kind of look at it and go, jeepers, if I'd known what I know then, what you do now. But I suppose that's what many people are in our industry, and many entrepreneurs would actually say, I think ignorance is what allows us, or naivety is what allows us to kind of move into these niches and play in them, because you don't know what the challenges are ahead of you, and you just forge through
Exactly.
them.
And you, when you get backed into a corner with challenges, and you find your way out and you
Yeah,
find what the right path is. I'm going to challenge you slightly on potential risks, but it'll be good to hear what you say. So you're shipping a liquid from Cape Town, right?
correct.
That's pretty heavy stuff. So you've got to have significant value, which I assume you've got. What's stopping someone in the destination country doing it themselves?
So, I mean, look, there were 2 parts to that. One is, well, nothing really. I mean, I think at the end of the day, we sell a product. We don't sell, it's not just a slurry of insects. Protex have got their slurry X, or I think it's called that. But basically, they create like a frozen block of lava, and that's absolutely a product. That's not what we do. So we have products that are anything from sort of a significant amount of the product is from insect, but not necessarily the bulk of it, all the way to having a product that is mainly insects with a little bit of other stuff in it. So again, these are products with a recipe and a protocol attached to them, which do make it a little bit harder to copy. So I suppose that recipe protocol is challenging to kind of manipulate the proteins and make those kind of flavors out of an insect. The second is the engineering of it is quite, I mean, I guess it's tricky. It's probably the hardest part, is trying to get these insects to a point that they can integrate into the pet food companies' lines, that it acts much like the existing products in that space. It sounds simple, and we've had lots of European engineers through our facility that go, of course, if we can like crush bones and do those type of things, of course we can, mull an insect. And you'd be surprised how strong that chitin exoskeleton is. And then I think thirdly, it's a long road of trying to prove all those things and put them all together into a product. So I assume in the next few years, some other products will come into the market in this space. But for now, we kind of seem to be the only one who's really focusing on it. So I'm not saying other people aren't doing it, because I think with the amount of people in the space, other people must be looking at it. But yeah, I would welcome more people to do it, because it would make it more mainstream. I think this idea that it's a winner takes all, either with palatants or meals, and one person has got to dominate the market and have 100 plants around the world, I think that is just, we're never going to become an industry if we have that mentality. So we're always open to collaboration and working with other companies. In fact, the way we kind of see it, to your point, is ideally the way we will scale in future is not necessarily to go create our market in Europe. Let's go build an insect facility in Europe. It'll be, there's a market in Europe. We want to go to Europe. Let's partner with someone who's focusing on and is really good at growing insects and growing them at a reasonable price point. And at that point, we will procure those and put them through our process to make local products. And that's absolutely on our radar. So whether it's whether in Europe or America or wherever. So we're absolutely open to partnerships, really. And my hope and suggestion to anybody would be, let's work together to make this work, rather than trying to work against each other, because we're all spending sort of different dollars trying to solve the same problem. And it just seems a bit silly, where we could sort of, we can focus and become more specialists in different areas. If you look at the broiler chicken market or the pig market or whatever farming market you want to, like, those markets need to fragment, and you need specialists and people working together in order to actually grow an industry. Because I think it's a stretch to say that we have an insect industry yet.
So if you need to get in touch with Dean, then he's on LinkedIn, and his website, just Google Maltento. you'll find it. If you want to look for a partnership, because that sounds like a great idea. Let's add some value into this space. Looking into the future, what are your plans for the future? Is it to stay in the pet food market? Is it to ramp up production? Tell me.
Yeah, so from a production perspective, ideal would be to move into one of the bigger markets, one of the bigger Western markets, and have our patent facilities there. So again, partnering with companies in those markets. So I don't really see us building more insect production at this point, unless there was a particularly good use case that someone wanted to do something that's got a big feedstock or a big offtake, and it made sense. But sort of, if I have a crystal ball and it goes our way, it would be to be much more focused on like the value add to the product. So starting with palatants and then looking into that gut health and starting to add sort of more functionality to those products and unlocking like the why of, why does it help a fish grow, etc. That's from a production perspective. I think we'll always focus on pet food because I think it's a really nice market. It's big. I think again we can make a difference to pet food if we can add this gut health and immunity benefits to pets as well and make them live longer with less medical bills. But in the long term, I think volume will come from your agricultural markets. So starting with aquaculture, because that's where we've had some good traction. I think being at the bottom of Africa hasn't helped us because there's not a huge amount of sort of high value aquaculture down in South Africa. There's only really, not even in South Africa, but Africa is obviously known for tilapia and catfish, which I don't think we're quite at the point that we can play into those markets. So it would be nice to be closer to the aquafeed companies doing more of the high value species from shrimp to salmon. So yeah, so I think for us, it's really pet food and aquaculture. We're looking into some poultry trials, but again, I think the price points that they need the products to get to is just a little bit unachievable, and the volumes at this point that it just doesn't make sense.
Sure. There's definitely similarities in that functional benefit from a small inclusion across all livestock species as well as pets. And to me, and from the conversations that we've had in the past, you're not a scientist, right? But you kind of understand the fundamentals of how it all works. And that's a credit to how long you've been in this industry more than anything. It kind of just shines a light on probably that your team at Maltento would also speak similarly. So perhaps that's the kind of the value that you're bringing, and like you said, it's not necessarily its production because there's lots of different people producing in different ways,
Yeah,
but it's the value add, and I think that has been grossly undervalued in the market to this point, and so it's great to have you looking at that, and I think it's a great idea and something that you can push for.
I think like, again, just back to the fact that we do this business model for anyone who's listening and who's a young entrepreneur trying to get in the space. I think my advice is find what you believe you're good at or where your interest lies. Don't try to solve the entire problem because it's not necessary anymore. So I think there's people who have been out there and have solved things. And, you spoke with Andrew from Chansey recently. That's one of my favorite businesses in the space, because I think what he's doing is so local market genius and works for his local market. But, if I were to try his model in South Africa, it just wouldn't work. It just doesn't make sense. So I think there is a lot of local market aspects, especially to the farming of the insect. But if you look at the global market, again, there's so much opportunity and so much niche there, that if you focus on that, you can actually do well. And by partnering with companies that do the other pieces well, I think we can grow this industry much quicker. And so again, it's not that farming in a Western style and higher cost and spent grain as a feedstock is the right way. It just depends on how you want to attack this problem. And I think that, we were speaking earlier just about, your model and how you're thinking about it. And if the waste regulations change in the UK, that it makes farming actually attractive. It's slightly different where we are. But I think that's what makes this space so exciting, is that there's so much nuance in how you can approach this problem and how you can fix it. It's not like, I want to be a craft brewer and start brewing beer. You can go online and you can, really, you can get a turnkey brewery operation and you can start marketing your beer. I mean, again, simplicity. This space is not like that at all. There's so much opportunity, so much to change, so much to optimize that, it really is at the beginning. And I think that's what keeps me hungry to keep kind of fixing the problems in this industry or fixing or seeking opportunity in it.
Absolutely. And I learned so much along those lines on my Nuffield scholarship of visiting all of these different places, seeing people doing it completely differently, aligning with regulations. But the ones that stuck out that were likely to fail or have already failed are those ones that I think tried to do something that doesn't fit into their local regulations, business context, environment, climate, all of those kinds of things. And because they didn't try to fit in. And that, I think, is crucial, as well as leveraging a global network so you can learn how people are doing it in other countries, like you talked about. Dean, I'm going to ask one more question. I'm going to ask you to get your crystal ball out and tell me what is happening in the BSF industry in 10, 20 years. Go for it.
I think equally interesting question, what's going to happen in the next 3 to 5 years, just because, as we said, everything's moving so fast. But I do think that it becomes a more normalized ingredient, and again, I think the different business models will speak to this. So you will have some products that, because of the feedstock that's available, you might have a little bit of inconsistency, but you can consolidate batches potentially, and you can create a more commoditized protein type product. Let's call it that for now. And it'll have its space. It will not be competing with fish meal. It'll not be competing with soy meal. It'll have its space in the protein matrix that allows it to move in. And similarly, the oil will find its space, whether that be in value add, like cosmetics, or even just in feed. So I think there will be business models that will cater to that have higher volumes. Then I think there will be other elements where we do unlock some functionality. So things like everything from gut health to immunity and the things that I guess we're looking at, which will play a complementary role to those products in the diet. So it's not like we're competing for the same pie. I think we're trying to make that pie bigger so that if you have a meal going in, you can sell a palatant on the side that also goes in and is a smaller inclusion. So I do think they become much more mainstream sources of a functional ingredient, again, whether that's more of a macro or more of a micro type ingredient that goes in. I do think there's an element of specialization that comes in. So again, companies focusing on different parts of the value stream and how we kind of work together, maybe some consolidation that allows us to specialize better and spend, again, not taking different pots of money and trying to solve the same thing because it's just inefficient. I think if we can find ways to consolidate in a mutually beneficial way that allows different people to be solving problems that can be fed up to actually make this an industry, whether that's a cooperative type model or a sort of bigger company, I think that becomes really interesting and exciting because I think that just makes our dollars go a little bit further and much more efficient. Yeah, I think that's in 3 to 5 years. I think this becomes fairly mainstream. I think what doesn't change is that this will always remain a localized business model. And so, again, what works in Kenya and what works in South Africa doesn't necessarily work in America or Europe. And you could probably argue that America and Europe are also very different. So I think it's exciting. It's certainly, I think it's positive and it's exciting. I think we kind of always joke that it's kind of a little bit of a tough time now because of some of the challenges that have happened to the industry. Some of the companies that have gone down, some of the sort of, there's some media that obviously gets out there that isn't necessarily positive. And so it's a little bit of a, as you said, the demand hasn't quite picked up yet. None of the big pet food companies, none of the big aqua guys are really adopting it at mass scale yet. And as soon as that happens, this industry will be good. But until then, it's kind of a bit of a case of like, spend responsibly, be nimble, and it's kind of a bit of hold your breath because when it comes, I think it will come properly. And yeah, and I think we can all do well out of this and make an industry here rather than having a winner takes all.
Sounds great. And I love the positivity. It's what we need in the industry, but also very prescient of what I felt coming out of BSF Con yesterday. A lot of positive energy. It's a welcome change. There was lots of different industry there, waste, aqua, livestock, lots of interest. And like you said, I think the industry is potentially turning a corner soon. And as long as we have sensible production, and we're actually trying to grow demand. So, Dean, it's been an absolute pleasure. We need more people like you adding value in the industry. If anyone does want to reach out, I've told you the contacts. If he doesn't reply, then he's probably in. What was that pub we went to in Cape Town?
Forrester's Arms.
Forrester's Arms, Forries, that's it. Yeah,
Delicious.
So you'll probably find him there at 5 o'clock, thinking a pint. So
you can always find me there and come have a beer with me there. It was a wonderful beer.
Good stuff. All right.
Thanks, David.
Cheers, Dean. See you later.
Yes. Bye.